Welcome everyone, we'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are Lost City Books and we're so pleased to have you on our live stream. Tonight we're welcoming Professor Zachary M. Schrag, author of The Fires of Philadelphia, in conversation with Professor Tyler Anbinder. Very happy to have both of you here. And for those of you who are new to our live stream, I'll let you know a little bit about who we've got joining us tonight. Firstly, we are Lost City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore located in Adams Morgan, DC. We specialize in an eclectic selection of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, art books, history, politics, and of course, sci-fi and fantasy and other speculative fiction. So you can find a little bit of everything at our store. We have a tight-knit team of some of DC's coolest kids, amongst whom I like to count myself, as always. We have artists, educators, musicians, writers, and of course, avid readers, all coming together to create this unique environment and curate our eclectic selection of books. I am your host for this evening. My name is Shady Rose, and as ever, I am very pleased to be here. About our author tonight, Zachary M. Schrag. Zachary is an Arlington, Virginia resident born in New York City. A graduate of Harvard and Columbia, he received his PhD in 2002. After receiving his doctorate, Schrag taught at Baruch College and Columbia University. In 2004, he joined the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University. Schrag's articles have been published in the Journal of Policy History, the Journal of Urban History, Research Ethics, Rethinking History, Technology and Culture, and Washington History. And his essays have appeared in the American Historian, AHA Perspectives, Bioethics Forum, Politico, TR News, the Washington Monthly, and the Washington Post. He is the author of 4 books: The Great Society Subway, A History of Washington Metro. I'm gonna have to give that one a read. Ethical Imperialism, Institutional Review Boards, and the Social Scientists. 1965 to 2009, The Princeton Guide to Historical Research, and The Fires of Philadelphia, Citizen Soldiers, Nativists, and the 1844 Riots Over the Soul of a Nation, which we're here to discuss tonight. Professor Tyler Anbinder is a specialist in 19th century American politics and the history of immigration and ethnicity in American life. His most recent book, City of Dreams, 2016, is a history of immigrant life in New York City from the early 1600s to the present. Before that, in 2001, he published 5 Points, a history of 19th century America's most infamous immigrant slum, focusing in particular on tenement life, interethnic relations, and ethnic politics. His first book, Nativism and Slavery, 1992, analyzed the role of the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic Know-Nothing Party on the political crisis that led to the Civil War. Professor Anbinder has won fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and held the Fulbright Thomas Jefferson Chair in American History at the University of Utrecht. He has won awards for his scholarship from the Organization of American Historians, the Columbia University School of Journalism, and the journal Civil War History. He also served as a historical consultant to Martin Scorsese for the making of The Gangs of New York. It's an interesting fun fact. All right, and about the fires of Philadelphia. It is a gripping and masterful account of the moment one of America's founding cities turned on itself, giving the nation a preview of the Civil War to come. America is in a state of deep unrest, grappling with xenophobia, racial and ethnic tension at a national scale that feels singular to our time. But it also echoes the earliest anti-immigrant sentiments of the country. In 1844, Philadelphia was set aflame by a group of Protestant ideologues, avowed Nativists, who were seeking social and political power, rallied by charisma and fear of the immigrant menace. For these men, it was Irish Catholics they claimed would upend morality and murder their neighbors, steal their jobs, and overturn democracy. The Nativists burned Catholic churches, chased and beat people through the streets, and exchanged shots with the militia seeking to reinstate order. So we're getting into some very deep historical issues and moments here. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests for the evening. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Hello, Zachary and Tyler. Welcome so much.
Thank you.
Hello.
We're so pleased to have you joining us tonight. And I think we can just go ahead and launch right in. If Zachary, you'd like to tell us about some of the major themes of this book and what its purpose is and sort of the greater lexicon of history about this moment.
Well, yes, thank you so much. And let me start by thanking you and Lost City Books for hosting this event. Obviously, I wish I were there in person. The little video you had of the bookshelves made me want to be in a bookstore, but here we are doing the best we can. And I'm also very grateful to Pegasus Books for helping out with this, and especially to Professor Anbinder, whose work, on immigration and nativism has been so important to my own. I'm really standing on his shoulders here, and he's been supportive over the many years it's taken me to work on this project. I think the 1840s sometimes get lost in the drama of the revolution on one end and Civil War on the other. Those are clearly periods that a lot of Americans know more about. But the 1830s and 40s are amazing in their own right. Everything seems to be up for grabs. The very boundaries of the country are uncertain. You've got, where does the United States end and British North America begin on the north? You've got this breakaway Republic of Texas that may or may not end up as part of the United States. To the west, the boundaries are uncertain. All of this is going to be fought over. And then you have this brand new system of political parties, Democrats and Whigs. So not quite the political party system we have today, but the idea of a two-party system is still pretty new in the 1830s and 40s, and it's not in the Constitution. Americans are figuring that out. And then Americans are figuring out what it means to be an American, because this is a period, again, where things are up for grabs. Obviously, the biggest fight, the one that ends up in the Civil War, is over the place of African Americans. They are, in many cases, losing ground in the 1830s, in Pennsylvania in particular. They are stripped of the right to vote. You have questions about indigenous peoples. This is the period of the Trail of Tears and other dispossessions and attacks on indigenous rights. Other groups as well, the Mormons, are fighting it out in Missouri and Illinois, trying to find a place for themselves in this country. And then there are the immigrants from many different parts of Europe, but especially Ireland, are coming in great numbers, especially to the East Coast, the port cities of Baltimore and New York and Boston, and of course, Philadelphia. And against the Irish are these groups called themselves the Nativists, or the Native Americans. It's a funny word because we think of that now referring to indigenous peoples, but in the 1840s, if you said, I'm a Native American, it meant that you were born in this country and that you believed that having been born in this country, you had rights that immigrants should not have, especially the right to become a citizen, the right to vote, the right to hold office, the right to have a government job. And so all of this is, again, up for grabs. Will the majority rule, or will minorities have equal rights? And so I start by trying to give a picture of this one city, Philadelphia. And part of the job of the historian is to make things manageable, simplify a bit. So I focus in this book on four major characters who represent different elements of Philadelphia. The first is, well, not in the order I introduced them, but the first I'll talk about tonight is Bishop Francis Patrick Kenrick. He's born in Ireland, and so he himself is an Irish immigrant. He's not the typical Irish immigrant. He's extremely educated. He trains for the priesthood in Rome itself. He speaks multiple languages. He keeps his diary and personal correspondence in Latin, which is kind of cool. But he's also the spiritual head of the tens of thousands of Irish Catholic immigrants who are there in Philadelphia. And so many of these are not well educated. Many of them are poor. Again, this is before the potato famine, but it doesn't mean that Ireland was a prosperous place in the early 1840s. The reason the potato famine gets to be so bad is that's all the food there was potatoes. And so a lot of Irish people are looking to get out. Some go to England, some go to what's now Canada, many come to the United States, and many come to Philadelphia. And a lot of them are working in textiles as handloom weavers. Some of them are working in the building trades or manual labor. But there are a lot of these, fairly impoverished Irish people who see opportunity in the new land, not just economic opportunity, but also greater religious and political freedom. And so, I try to tell the story of some of these others. Unfortunately, it can be hard to find records of these working class folks, but they show up. And so with Henrik, I have some weavers and lawyer and some priests and other Irish folk. So that's on one end. Opposing these people are the nativists that I mentioned before. And the chief among them is this fascinating figure named Lewis Levin. Levin himself, ironically enough, is the son of immigrants. He's born in Charleston, but his parents have immigrated from England. They're Jews. He seems to abandon the faith fairly young. He marries Christian women. The first one dies. He marries again. So he seems to be cut off from the Jewish community. It's a little hard to pin down his exact religious identity, but he probably converts to some form of Protestantism. And, he unfortunately is a figure that's all too common in US history, a very talented person, a great communicator, a great speaker with no morals at all. I mean, he's just ambitious and will ride whatever cause seems to get him the most attention and money and power. And again, in the 1840s, that seems to be railing against Catholics and Irish immigrants in particular. He can't do this alone. He's backed up with nativists, both in Philadelphia and around the country. In fact, the nativist movement that I talk about really starts in New York. with a fellow you may have heard of, Samuel F.B. Morse, best known for his telegraph, but also a rabid anti-Catholic who helped start the political nativist movement in New York in the 1830s. And as that movement rises in New York City, Philadelphians say, hey, maybe we can replicate that here. So they create what becomes a third political party beyond the Democrats and Whigs, variously called the American Republican or the Native American Party. The third group that I talk about is the militia. And again, this is a very confusing term today. When you say militia, do you mean National Guardsmen who are subject to military discipline, or do you mean some kind of private group out in the woods who are arming and drilling by themselves? And it was every bit as confusing in the 1840s as it is now. Militia could mean just sort of every white man from ages 1845 is theoretically enrolled in the militia and can be called to military duty. But it's kind of a joke. They might drill once or twice a year. That's really not enough to be militarily prepared. They show up with broomsticks or corn stalks, and they elect, crazy people as officers. So they are, the idea of a universal militia is pretty discredited by the time of my story. There's another group within that, variously called the uniformed militia or the volunteer militia. And you can think of them much more like a volunteer fire department today. They're very good at what they do. They're very serious about it. Or as today's National Guard, they are tied into the state system. They are, they are in the state constitution. They get some support from the state. On the other hand, unlike today's National Guard, they're kind of self-organized. So instead of joining a company, you can form a company with some friends, and it can be people who you're friends with. It could be people of your political group. They're actually naming companies after politicians. It could be an ethnic group. So you have German companies, you have Irish companies. And of course, this becomes quite serious when they are called out to fight. Who will they be loyal to? And the chief militia character I have in here is General George Cadwalader. He's the heir to one of the founding families, essentially, of Pennsylvania. His ancestor came over with William Penn in the 1690s. And he's very aristocratic, very well educated, very wealthy. He really could just sort of clip his coupons if he wanted to, but what he really likes to do is train as a soldier. So he becomes brigadier general in 1842, still in his 30s. And he's backed up with some very colorful characters as well. One of my favorites is Augustus Pleasanton, who has this wonderful diary where he says nasty things about everyone he meets. And so I think of Cadwalader and Levin as kind of kings on the opposite side of a chessboard. I'm not sure they ever meet, but they're pushing and pulling and sending pawns at each other. And then the last fourth major character I want to mention here is the man in the middle. And this is Sheriff Morden McMichael. His name is Irish. His ancestry is Protestant Irish. He's born in the United States. So he's got some immigrant background, but he's also native born. He starts off as a Democrat. He goes into the Whig Party. He attracts votes across the aisle. He seems, as best I can, he seems to want to be friends with everyone in Philadelphia. And I admire him for that. It doesn't work. There are some conflicts that, even the most well-meaning man can't negotiate. But he's a fascinating figure. And, really, if there's anyone I'd like to meet from the story, it's probably Morden McMichael. And he doesn't represent just one community. He kind of, I think, represents the conscience of Philadelphia of trying to keep a lid on some of this conflict.
Zach, can you explain why, having written books about post-1945 America, the Washington Metro, institutional review boards, why you decided to go so far back in time and write about the pre-Civil War period?
So, that's a great question. I certainly was trained in 20th century history. One of the topics I was interested in were the riots of the 1960s and since then. And at one point, this book has gone through various mutations. One of the versions was going to be about riot control in the 20th century, obviously a very important topic. Another version, once I got into that, I thought, well, the most curious element that I really want to focus in, at least for the time being, is the National Guard. Because again, if you're familiar with the riots in the 1960s in Detroit and Newark and in Washington, it's often the National Guard who's called out to support the police. You have to ask, is that a good idea? In the 20th century, they are better trained at riot control than they were in the 19th century, but they're still primarily armed and trained for warfare and not policing. So it's a little weird to call out the National Guard. And also there's an American tradition of not really liking to see troops in the streets. So I thought, okay, who had that idea of calling out the National Guard in times of civil disorder? And I started pulling on that thread, and I ended up in the 1830s and 1840s. And so in some way, there's actually a history of the 1960s hidden in this book of the 1840s, because the debate that they have over riots and their place in democracy and how you try to address them, whether with negotiation or violence or something in between, all of those debates that we had in the 1960s, all of those debates we have in 2020 are also present in 1844. And I think they become central for the first time in 1844, because these riots that I wrote about are the first time that the militia really clashes with a mob in a sustained way in an American city.
So in what way was it difficult to switch gears from modern America to early middle American history in terms of, say, your sources or the research? How was it? How did it change how you went about your project?
So the sources for the 1840s are surprisingly abundant. That's part of the reason it took me so long. Some of these newspapers, they only exist in single copies, and I was actually very carefully turning the pages to not damage the one copy we have of that issue of the newspaper in various repositories, Library of Congress, Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and so forth. One of the great things that's happened to historians in the last 20 years is the mass digitization of sources. So Google Books and various newspaper databases were turning up things about people that would have been difficult or impossible to find. So in that way, people talk about abundance versus scarcity in historical sources. The 1840s, however far back they are abundant in a way that, say, the 1740s are not. You did have steam printing presses. You had, it was very cheap. Levin, I should say, was a newspaper editor. He got started with very little money. And so a lot of people were printing a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that survives. The difficult thing for me, having written on Metro, where I did 60 interviews with architects and engineers and all the rest, was I could not find any eyewitnesses to the 1844 riots to interview. That might surprise you, but they just weren't around. So again, I would love to have a seance with McMichael, especially. I don't think I would really get anything out of Levin. He just was a slippery, untrustworthy person. I don't think I would believe anything he said to me in the interview. Cadwallader left a fair amount of paper, letters and things. I might get some things out of him. It's really, what I'd love to do would be some of the people, again, a little less prominent. Some of these Irish weavers would love to get their views, or some of the men, the militia captains. But again, one of the great things about riots is there's often an investigation. You may have noticed there's a little debate right now about how we're going to remember January 6th. But traditionally, a riot produces a pretty thick report. The Kerner Commission or Scranton Commission, we're used to that. They didn't quite have those reports in the 1840s, but they did have murder trials where people would testify, and there would be reporters there taking shorthand notes with verbatim testimony, and just pages and pages of it. Some of it, well, a lot of it made it into the book. So when I read, you'll hear some of that dialogue coming right off the page from the 1840s.
Was it a difficult adjustment having to read handwritten sources, whereas I imagine in the post-1945 period, most everything was typed?
It really depends on the person. McMichael had terrible handwriting, but we only have a few of his letters left. So, I was able to get through those. Again, Augustus Pleasanton, you can read that as easily as a typewriter. I mean, it's just beautifully done. Cadwallader somewhere in the middle, but the good news was once he's brigadier general, he's got clerks writing for him, and the clerks will tidy up the handwriting. And then again, a lot of these statements are reprinted in newspapers. So in some cases, I would have a handwritten letter from the 1840s. I'm looking at it, but I've also seen it reprinted in the newspaper. And yeah, I'm going to use the typewritten version of it. Thank you very much. I'm not, I'm a little more sensible than that.
I'll also take a moment to remind our viewers that you can ask a question of our guest tonight by leaving a comment right below the video that you're watching right now, and we'll be able to answer those throughout the event. Something that came up for me as you were just speaking on these things, though, is the deep sense of humanity of all of these histories that you're investigating. You know, it seems that you have a pretty strong sense of what kind of people your four major subjects are, and I'd love to hear a bit more about how you came into that information and how you were able to sort of wrap it all up and reflect on it as you were writing this.
Yeah, so you know, in some ways, these folks play about a wealthy Philadelphia lawyer whose father was a general in the War of 1812, whose grandfather was a general in the Revolutionary War, who's very good looking, who has some of the finest horses in the United States. You think of this kind of arrogant, may be a little hard, because, you know, arrogance kind of implies that your opinion of yourself is over your ability. And I think Cadwallader was actually a very able man in all of his pursuits. But, you know, he's very much the type of an American aristocrat. I mean, again, theoretically, America is a democracy. We don't have titles, but if anyone had a title, I mean, you know, people knew who he was. The very name Cadwallader meant something. It still does. It's still a prominent family. And, you know, Kenrick, again, he's an educated Catholic bishop. He is, you know, a man of great faith, believes in the church, believes in hierarchy, as the Catholic Church does. He is less colorful than his sort of protege, I think I would call him, John Hughes. John Hughes is a priest under Kenrick in Philadelphia. Then he becomes Bishop of New York and famous as Dagger John. And he's, you know, probably the most famous Irish Catholic bishop of the 19th century. And you know, he's more political, will say stuff to get people angry. Kenrick is a little more retiring. I can't place him at any scene of violence. You know, he'll sort of move out of the way and call for calm. But again, that's kind of what you would expect of a bishop. Levin, as I say, he's a little more colorful, because he does seem to change with the wind. He's got this incredible arc where 1841, 1842 or so, he's a drunk, and he admits this. I mean, he calls himself a drunkard. He dries out and presents himself as a reformed drunkard. He goes bankrupt. And again, I went to the Maryland State Archives and pulled out the bankruptcy records, so I can tell you how many spoons he owned before they were taken away from him in bankruptcy proceedings. And those were handwritten sources, I can tell you that. So he's more curious in that way. And then again, you'll have these, and then you've got these minor characters, you know, so I don't have any women as my top tier of characters, but I have women's voices in there. Again, with these murder trials, you have these women who describe the riots, how they're at home and their husband comes in and says, we've got to hide, and they bar the door and there's gunfire outside, or, you know, they're trying to persuade their sons not to go out and fight. So we've got these glimpses of people's lives that the riots illuminate. And so it's really fascinating to get glimpses of that. Yeah, we have some letters from people. I have this series of correspondence. There's one family where this couple have gone to, I think, a political convention in New Jersey, leaving their young son in the care of his aunt. And so the aunt is writing back and forth, the mother, their sisters, right? And she's saying, oh yeah, we're safe, but you know, the little boy wanted to see the soldiers, so I took him out to see the soldiers. You know, it's the best thing that ever happened to a 9-year-old boy, is to have a martial law imposed in, you know, his own block. So yeah, it's incredible the kinds of voices, and that's, you know, part of the reason I kept with the book, is just to hear these voices coming at me saying, you know, please tell my story.
Now might be a good time for you to read the an excerpt from the book, and then we could talk more about the specific riots themselves.
Great. So, you know, I should say there are two waves of riots. One in May of 1844 to the north of downtown Philadelphia, and then a somewhat tense interlude and a second outburst in July of 1844. The book starts with a kind of glimpse of May 1844. And what's happened is there's this new political party, again, Levin is part of it, and they're holding rallies around Philadelphia. And they decide to hold one in the third ward of Kensington, which is predominantly Irish Catholic. And this is Friday, May 3rd. They're chased away. No one's hurt, but they're chased off the stage. And they decide they're going to come back. The nativists are going to come back and show the Irish who's boss. And so Levin and some of his friends show up on Monday, May 6th, 1844. They're giving some speeches. I'll skip the speeches and get to the point where Levin is waiting to speak. Okay. By the time, so we've got a fellow named Don Perry speaking. By the time Perry began, the nativists had been at for an hour, and the Kensington Irish had readied a response. At Carter, John O'Neill pulled up in a wagon, driving his horse from 2nd Street onto the vacant lot, right into the crowd. O'Neill got within 6 yards of the stage, then pulled the pin to dump his load of yellow dirt. Nearby Catholics laughed and applauded. Natives were outraged. One grabbed O'Neill's horse and demanded to know if O'Neill was deliberately disrupting the meeting. O'Neill, possibly drunk, replied he would return as often as he damn pleased. Still other carters arrived, each with a small load of dirt to dump. Yet even then, with belligerent Irishmen dumping dirt on the boots of the native born, everyone kept their hands to themselves. Finally, it was time for Levin to speak. Let's skip a bit. And he's been in a fight the previous few days. With his hands still bruised from punching the old man, Kensington Levin was now again fight. As he waited to speak and watched O'Neill drive his horse into the crowd, he leaned over to warn a friend. This is evidently the signal for the attack. The attack came, but from an unexpected direction, above. As Levin rose to speak, a sudden storm whipped through Philadelphia, with wind strong enough to tear awnings off buildings and limbs from trees. A drenching rain came with it, clearing the lot more effectively than any nativist rhetoric or Irishmen's carts of dirt. A more superstitious group might have taken this storm as an omen that it was time to go home, and a few nativists did just that. John Carroll's Tavern lay just to the south of the vacant lot, and at least one of Levin's intended listeners headed there for a dry seat and a wet drink. But most of the natives ran for the shelter of the Washington Market, only about 70 yards away, shouting and hooting and laughing as they went. A few rolled a hogshead toward the mob so that Levin would have a place to stand. This simple decision to seek shelter rather than go home changed everything. Up to that point, the natives had been heckled and harassed, but not seriously threatened. A few cartloads of dirt was an insult, not an actual attack. And the Third Ward Irish seemed ready to let the natives proceed with their rally on the vacant lot, shouting to the wind. The Irish had not physically harmed anyone. To the contrary, they had helped a nativist off the stage on Friday so that he would not be injured when they tore it down. All of this suggests that both sides had been working off a rough script that dictated how to disagree publicly in an election season. Now, however, by changing the scene from the vacant lot to the market house, the natives were deviating from that script. The covered market was the pride of the Third Ward. Opened just 3 years earlier, its publicly owned arcade sheltered a block of Washington Street, running about 250 feet from Master Street on the south to Jefferson Street on the north. Under its protections, farmers and victualers leased stalls to feed the families of the surrounding neighborhoods. It had also become a political center. The previous year, in January of 1843, striking weavers seized the arcade and brutally and successfully defended it against the sheriff and his posse, who had marched from Philadelphia proper. Now, 15 months later, neighborhood men, probably including some veterans of the previous year's fight, faced a second invitation from the city. As the natives arrived, one market worker rolled up his sleeves and grumbled to his mates, "Keep the damn natives out of the market house. This ground don't belong to them, this is ours." His listeners rolled up their sleeves as well. They were joined by hecklers from the vacant lot who had made it to shelter before the natives did. When the soggy, high-spirited natives arrived, they did nothing to placate the Kensington men. Still shouting and whooping, they tore into the market, climbed onto the stalls, jumped from one to another, then planted their American flag in the middle of the market. Levin, standing on a stall, or perhaps the hogshead, tried to resume his speech. He managed only 8 words. "Fellow citizens, we have reached an important crisis," before the trouble began. As Levin began to speak, Kensington residents faced off. Protestant against Catholic. Some of the men had been present for the meeting on Friday. Now they resumed their argument about whether the natives should be allowed to speak in peace. Now let's make a noise so he won't be heard, one man suggested, and he and a companion did just that. David Fields, a Protestant immigrant from Ireland, was not on bad terms with the Catholics he saw in the market, but he feared they would repeat their attack of Friday. For God's sake, he begged, let us be quiet and listen to the speaker. You old rascal, John Mickeldoon replied, you're always talking. One witness who had watched from the third-story window of the public school at first saw only two men, possibly Fields and Mickeldoon, fighting, although another 18 or 20 watched and egged them on. Another thought that groups of about 8 or 10 Catholic and Protestant Irishmen each started fighting before most of the nativists from the rally had even arrived. The fight escalated from fists to sticks, and then from sticks to stones, easy enough to find in the perpetual construction site that was Kensington. More brawlers, including the native refugees from the storm, joined in. Men outside the building hurled bricks at the nativists, who picked them up and hurled them right back. Soon the market house was filled with natives and their adversaries slugging it out, while others spilled into the surrounding streets, some of them throwing stones at the house on Cadwallader Street to the west. 5 Kensington Irishmen surrounded a young man from the city, snarling at him. The youth pulled out 2 pistols and threatened to shoot anyone who attacked him. A Kensington man dared him to shoot. Then some men from the firehouse next door rush over. One of the firemen, Patrick Fisher, decided to act. An Irish Catholic immigrant, he lived on the same block as the hose house and likely knew many of the men on the market. For a time, he had served as constable of the ward until a charge of wrongdoing in office forced his resignation. Now, though no longer a professional lawman, he thought he could bring peace, so he rushed across the vacant strip to the market. He seemed a bit unsteady as he went. Perhaps he had swallowed some courage while toasting the new firehouse bell. But he managed to climb onto a market stall where he started shouting for people to go home. Then everyone heard a gunshot, and Fisher collapsed on the stall, his face bloody. Joseph Wood, a reporter, saw the flash, and he understood at once that yet more unspoken rules had been violated. A brawl was one thing, a gunfight another. My God, Wood cried, they've got firearms. As in many riots before and since, the first gunshot destroyed whatever restraint had previously held the crowd. Hurrah for the natives, shouted Fisher's assailant, and kill the damned Irish. Come, another cried, let's get some guns and give the rascals their due.
That's wonderfully evocative, really, really well done. So can you explain, you mentioned before that there are 2 riots. Can you explain where the scene you just described fits in the sequence of events and kind of sum up why there are 2 riots and what the consequences are?
Yeah, so the first wave of rioting, again, is up in Kensington, predominantly Irish Catholic neighborhood. It starts in that market house, and again, precedes the firehouses and the houses nearby. And then on the third day, the nativists attack 2 Catholic churches and burn them out. They gut them with arson, as well as the adjacent priest's house and some other Catholic institutions. And so this is, again, I talk about the unspoken rules of rioting. There are some things you can do, and then there's some things that are kind of beyond rules, and burning down churches, especially white people's churches, is kind of beyond what anyone considers acceptable. So that leads to a period of martial law, and that's where little Freddie Meyer gets to see his soldiers, and the troops, Cadwallader's troops, fan out to protect the city, protect the Catholic churches, and they succeed. No more Catholic churches are burned in May. Then there's this. What the nativists do is they spend most of June planning a massive July 4th parade. We've just been through July 4th. We think of it as this great patriotic holiday, but many times in American history, it's also been used by one group or another to assert their special Americanness, and no time more than in 1844. Today, you may know, is July 12th, which is the commemoration of the Battle of the Boyne. And in Northern Ireland, there's this tradition of marching on July 12th to sort of show Protestant dominance over Catholics. That doesn't work as well in an American context because it's all tied into loyalty to the king. So instead, these Protestant supremacists, which is basically what they are, use July 4th. And they march in red, white, and blue but they use a lot of the same techniques. They march into Kensington again, they march right past a bunch of Catholic churches, and they're, I think, showing off their power. And a lot of people expect this to turn into a second round of rioting, and perhaps, very likely, another round of attacks on Catholic churches. So a Irish-born priest named John Patrick Dunn prepares for this by filling his church with armed guards. And amazingly enough, this does not start a riot on July 4th, but on July 5th, his Protestant neighbors figure out that this Catholic church across the street is full of armed Catholic Irishmen, and they get very upset. And they mob the church, and they demand that the guns be taken out. And this starts another series of conflicts that ends up in a climactic showdown on July 7th, 1844, where Cadwallader again marches the militia into southward to the south of the city to defend this Catholic church. So it's really a series of attacks on Catholic institutions. The cover of the book has one of those, St. Michael's, being burned. It's not the only Catholic church that gets attacked in these two rounds of rioting.
How did you deal with the issue that historians have to deal with, where you would probably have, in this case, some newspapers saying the Irish were all at fault, and other newspapers saying the Nativists were all at fault, and some saying that the Nativists threw the first punches or fired the first shots, and some saying no, it was the other side. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, this took me a long time, and again, some of this is very contemporary. I mean, it really, there were at its peak something like 18 daily newspapers in Philadelphia alone, and then there were weekly newspapers and biweekly newspapers and all these different perspectives, and a lot of it felt like reading social media, because you'd have some news reporting, but then a lot of the coverage was actually individuals saying, here's what I saw. And then the next day, someone would say, oh no, that guy said that. Well, no, he's wrong. Here's what I saw. And sometimes it would be in the same newspaper, and sometimes there would be rival newspapers kind of subtweeting each other. I don't know what people said before subtweeting, but whatever they did, that's what they were doing, where they wouldn't quite mention the other newspaper by name, or they'd have some slur, the Paupers Journal says this. So it took me a while to figure out, oh, they're talking about that guy. Then some of these newspapers, one of the best native newspapers I found was in the Library of Congress, and they'd be responding to something else that's up in Philadelphia, so I'd have to be up on Amtrak, to reconstruct this dialogue. And there are parts of it where you just throw up your hands. And I think this is true of a lot of historians. There's a great new book on the Boston Massacre by, I think it's Serena Zabin is her name. And I heard her talk, and someone asked her, okay, who did what first in Boston in 1770? She just shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. I'm at peace with not knowing who fired the first shot. And we have to do that as historians. But what we can figure out is some people are just plain lying. They say, oh yeah, Cadwallader stormed in, and within 15 minutes he was shooting. And I find all of the events that happened, and I say, no, that had to take at least an hour. If people are giving you wildly different accounts of when something happened, and one man remembers, oh, yes, it happened right after I got out of church, and church lets out at noon. Well, I'm going to believe him, because he had a very specific reason for thinking that thing happened right at noon, as opposed to someone saying, oh yeah, it happened sometime during the day, maybe it was 1 o'clock. So we do have some tools, but we also have to have some humility as well in knowing that we don't have time machines. And if someone else looked at this evidence, or even if I looked at the same evidence again, I might come up with a somewhat different account.
And did the police or the prosecutors take one side over the other and favor one side over the other in the aftermath?
So there was a grand jury report that early on that was very anti-Catholic, and Bishop Kenrick does have to organize a response to that. Interestingly enough, he does not let any Irish Catholics be part of that response. He picks born Americans to show that Catholics can be citizens too. I think that was a very strategic choice on his part. In the aftermath, both nativists and Irish Catholics are tried for murder. Very few of them have any significant sentences. Again, it's very hard to prosecute people for rioting. They did not have cell phone video and Facebook selfies the way that we do for January 2021. Much as I would like to see those videos of July 1844. So it's very hard to establish, was the man in the black cap the same, was he the defendant? And also, so many people had gotten away with murder, literally, that I think the prosecutors felt a little bad that they were, singling out the few people who were unlucky enough to have gotten caught. Lewis Levin, who is probably, responsible as much for anything, he can't be charged with murder. He wasn't there on the scene. He kind of skedaddles when the guns start firing. He is indicted for treason against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but that unfortunately does not stick. He is indicted essentially for criticizing Cadwallader after the riots. The free speech law was not as developed as it becomes in the 20th century, but even then it was going to be pretty hard to convict a newspaper editor for expressing an opinion. So it's pretty hard to say that anyone was really held responsible given the amount of damage that was done to people and property. There were some civil lawsuits. Interestingly enough, the people really stuck with the bill were the taxpayers of Philadelphia, because under the law that they had then, maybe still now, if there's a riot that's uncontrolled and your church is destroyed, it's the county, not the individuals who started the fire who's financially responsible. So eventually it takes years, but eventually the city and county of Philadelphia have to pay that money.
Oh, Tyler, you're muted right now.
Sorry. Are there any political repercussions from the riots? Does either side make political hay of this and use it to gain more political power?
Yeah, so this is sort of the disappointing part in it. I would have preferred an ending where this violence discredits the nativists forever. Instead, they're wildly successful, at least in the short term, in the elections of 1844. Back then, you had local and state elections in October, and then the presidential elections in November. And in the October election, they win 4 seats in Congress, including one for Lewis Levin. Like, this terrible person is elected to Congress. They come close to winning the mayoralty of Philadelphia. They win a lot of local offices. And on the other hand, the riots may help lose the presidential election of 1844 for Henry Clay, because up to that point, the Irish were predominantly Democratic voters, but not entirely. They were, willing to listen to both sides. And because Clay's running mate, New Jersey man named Frelinghuysen, is a nativist, not by party affiliation, but by sentiment, no Irish immigrant is going to vote for Henry Clay, or at least no Irish Catholic immigrant. And this may help swing Pennsylvania and New York, which is even more important for Polk, with incalculable consequences, because that leads to the Mexican War and the annexation of California and Texas. And we can't even imagine very far what the world would be like if New York had gone for Clay. And it keeps the Irish vote. I mean, the Irish remain a pretty reliable Democratic constituency, into the presidency of John F. Kennedy. This really, in some ways polarizes that community. In a few years, Levin is terrible at Congress. I mean, he can't get jobs for his supporters because he's not a member of either of the major parties. He doesn't actually have any ideas, except the Pope is bad. And, he's eventually laughed out of Congress after 3 terms. But the nativist spirit, I think, remains. And, for people who are interested in the resurgence of nativism in the 1850s, I think a great book on that is Nativism and Slavery by Tyler Anbinder, about the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s and how that complicates politics, even at the same time as slavery becomes the major issue. A lot of that eventually gets absorbed into the new Republican Party. And Michael is actually a major figure in founding the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. The Republicans include a lot of people who are more welcoming to immigrants as well. Abraham Lincoln, you may have heard of. But there is definitely a nativist strain in the Republican Party that lingers into the 20th and I'd argue into the 21st century.
I see that we have a question here from one of our viewers, actually related to what you just spoke about. Anthropologa asks, I know that there were ties between the temperance movement and both the nativist and abolitionist movements. Do you know anything about the position of the abolitionists towards the nativist cause?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So Levin, temperance was actually Levin's first, well, not his very first cause, but he was a temperance editor for a while. And so yes, there were a lot of Protestants who saw temperance and Protestantism and sort of right thinking all going together. There were certainly Catholic temperance people as well. There was a Catholic temperance movement in Philadelphia and other places. But Levin comes to blame, he'll blame anything on the Pope if he can, including the demon rum. And then abolitionism is complicated as well. So the nativists themselves, seem not to take a position, but they have links. So Peter Sken Smith, who's one of the leading nativists in Philadelphia, is the older brother of Gerrit Smith, who's a founder of the Liberty Party and a leading abolitionist. And so you certainly have a lot of nativists who, again, are going to sort of blame the sin of slavery on the Irish. It doesn't really work terribly well, in part. This gets a little complicated. At this time, in the 1840s, the Irish in Ireland are trying to gain autonomy within the British Empire, a kind of home rule that would repeal the Act of Union between England and Ireland and restore an Irish parliament. And that becomes the repeal movement. And the leader of that movement, Daniel O'Connell, says to his American followers, look, if you want freedom for Ireland, you should also be supporting freedom for the African Americans. And this is an incredibly controversial move for him to make. It splits the repeal movement in the United States between people who want to just condemn O'Connell for meddling in American affairs, and those who say, well, maybe he has a point. And John Patrick Dunn, this priest who defends his church, he's actually on the O'Connell side. There are no simple divisions here. I guess it's terrible to ask a historian. They always say, "Oh, it's complicated," but it's not that. The nativist immigrant division does not line up neatly between abolition and pro-slavery at all. There are some on each side. And McMichael, I should mention, one of the things that drives him to prominence is he defends a school for African Americans against the mob. So again, this is part of his trying to be friends with everyone. He does try to defend Philadelphia's African American community, which is very frequently being attacked in this period in the 1830s and 1840s.
Thank you. Tyler, you can go ahead. The other question that we had was answered.
Okay, great. Zach, I think it would be really helpful if you could, well, first of all, just comment on one thing you said. Can you imagine a terrible person being elected to Congress? That's not something that could happen today. So I'm just shocked that it happened in the 1840s. So it's also interesting, he's reelected 2 times, right? He serves 3 terms. So again, even terrible people can get elected and reelected. I think it'd be really helpful for the audience for you to kind of explain how what happened in the 1840s helps us understand American politics today. Because you talked about that to me when we spoke this afternoon. I thought it was really interesting, the ways in which this story really has modern resonance.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this started out as a book on riot control, so that was my initial thought. This was not. I began thinking about this, to some extent. I'd worked on riots in the 1990s as an undergraduate, but particularly we had all those World Bank riots, right, in Seattle and in DC. I was thinking that would be significant, and then with the Trump campaign in 2015 and beyond, making immigration restriction a centerpiece of his campaign and his presidency, I thought that the immigration part would end up being more significant. And so I spent a lot of time, learning about the debates over immigration. One thing to think about here is today we kind of have a bifurcated anti-immigrant movement where there are people who are more concerned about economic competition, especially from Latin Americans. They're here to take our jobs, that kind of thing. And those, this more cultural, religious, anti-immigrant sentiment against Muslims, oh, they want to impose Sharia law. If you combine those two together, you get anti-Irish sentiment of the 1840s, where they're both seen as economic threats and as bringers of Catholicism, this foreign religion that is anti-democratic. So I think this sheds some light on the politics of immigration and nativism. So, I thought that would be the contribution. And then in 2020, we had the biggest resurgence of civil disorder we've had, maybe since 1970 with the George Floyd protests. And the National Guard was called out, I think, in over 30 states to address this. And, you saw the videos again of people in Portland and in Lafayette Square. And so I think that, reminds us that, a city can turn into essentially a battlefield in a matter of hours. And that this, political protest is absolutely a part of our democracy. It's right there in the Constitution. Peaceable assembly is in the First Amendment. We need that. But we also need some order as well. We do not want mob rule. And if you didn't believe that before January 6th, maybe you believe that since. So, in a horrible way, the immigration stream was one part of the book and the riot was another part of the book. And then on January 6th, we kind of had a nativist riot bringing everything together. And if you did watch President Biden's inaugural speech, he was the first president to say the word nativist in a presidential inauguration, and he was the first president to say the term riotous mob in an inauguration. So unfortunately, this book is far more relevant than I would wish it to be.
I did not know either of those things. How interesting. In some ways, the rioters attacking the Catholics, it kind of reminds me of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century, which was also very anti-Catholic. Are there any parallels, or are those very different?
I think there are. And again, this would, to do this right, you'd really need to look at, I think, the what we call the Atlantic world, because a lot of these traditions are coming out of Europe, of Ireland and Scotland. The Klan claims all of these Scottish symbols. The fiery cross, for example, is claimed to be from Scotland. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But the term Klan, of course, is a Scottish term. So they see themselves as the heirs to some Scottish tradition. The Orange Marches that we mentioned, again, people in the 21st century may associate those specifically with Northern Ireland, with Belfast, with Londonderry or Derry. But in the 19th century, they are taking place throughout Ireland. They're taking place in England. They're taking place in British North America, what we now call Canada. And they're even taking place in the United States. In July 12th, 1831 in Philadelphia, there's an Orange March. And then later, as you know, in New York City, there are two in 1870 and 1871, both of which end with many people dead. So this idea of some kind of Protestant supremacist march, whether it's, you call it Orange, whether you call it Ku Klux Klan, whether it's the Nativists, it is a not very attractive political tradition that can end in violence. So I do think there are linkages there, even if it can be a little hard to exactly show causality. Another thing I'll just mention quickly is, the know-nothings get their name in part because of their secrecy, and they have uniforms and lodges and secret orders. My nativists of the 1840s don't do that. That's much more an innovation that comes into place after the riots. And some of those lodges are founded in 1845 and onward. So that sense of nativism as a fraternal order really gets going a little later and is much more prevalent in the 1850s.
Thank you. This has all been so incredibly fascinating, and we're coming up on 8 o'clock. So I'd like to ask you a bit about, more generally, who you hope to reach with this book, and what you think its impact might be. What are some reactions that you've had so far?
I certainly hope to tell a story here. I hope that came through in the reading some. Again, you heard a lot of dialogue in there. Get our guns, give the rascals their due. I did not invent dialogue. In a few cases, I took a paraphrase and kind of made it back into dialogue, but most of that dialogue is right from those murder trials or other documents of the period. So I felt that I could be very faithful to the sources and still get, again, what people were saying, what they were wearing. You get that in a murder trial, the landscape, lots of detail in there. So I'm trying to, I grew up reading Bruce Cadden's History of the Civil War and Barbara Tuchman and, those great narrative writers. So I hope this is a book for people who like good story. My 14-year-old daughter recently read it and she enjoyed it. So she said there's a lot of fighting in there. A lot of people who should not have guns had guns, and can't disagree with that. But I also, hope that there are, if not morals and lessons, because that's dangerous ground, at least some good questions raised here, again, about what it means to be a democracy when you have, again, a majority Protestant society and the minority religion is being attacked. Will they majority folks show up and defend those churches? And that's, to me, the hopeful part of this is that some of Cadwallader's troops didn't really like Catholics very much. They did not, some of them left and sort of joined the mob, but others stayed in uniform and did their duty and said, we may not like these people, but we will defend them to the death, and gave their lives and in support and defense of this oppressed minority. So I think there are, some hopeful readings about this story as well. A lot of history is pretty grim, but maybe we can find some reasons for hope as well.
Absolutely, thank you. And Tyler, I know that you have at least one major work that's pretty directly related to the subjects in the fires of Philadelphia. Would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about nativism and slavery as well?
Sure. Well, yeah, so I've actually written two books that kind of touch on this. One is Nativism and Slavery, which is a history of the Know Nothing Party, which was the anti-Catholic, anti-Irish political party that grew out of the events in Philadelphia. As Zach said, those Philadelphia nativists kind of started creating lodges, political organizations through which they could spread their movement, and that ends up becoming what's known as the Know Nothing Party, which was the most successful third party in American history for a good up through the end of the 19th century. And they elected more than 100 congressmen and a half a dozen governors and 1,000 legislators across the country. And that was the biggest, certainly the most politically successful anti-immigrant movement in American history. But then another book I wrote called 5 Points is a history of New York's most famous Irish neighborhood. And the history of that neighborhood contains a lot of the same kinds of themes that Zach covers, but in New York. And so you have quite a few anti-Irish riots taking place, and then riots between the Irish as well. So some of the same things that happened in Philadelphia will continue in New York. So I've kind of looked at both sides, the nativist side in Nativism and Slavery, and the Irish side in 5 Points.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'd like to thank both of you for joining us tonight. This has been a really great conversation, incredibly insightful. And I think that our viewers tonight also gained a lot from hearing you speak about the fires of Philadelphia and the sundry therein contained historical events. If our viewers would like to, say, follow your academic work from here on, where could they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter far too much. Not as much as some, but too much. So it's at Zachary Schrag, and certainly, if I have an essay based on this or something, it goes up there. So I post there. I also have a personal website and a teaching website for how to write history, historyprofessor.org, that people might be interested in.
And for me, I am not as active on Twitter as Zach, though I like to follow along people like him. But the best way to follow what I'm doing, if you're interested in learning more, is either my homepage at George Washington University, where I was on the faculty. I just retired, so I'm emeritus, but I still have my page there, and that has all of my work and links to that work, and a lot of it is available for free online. And also you can email me if you want to learn more about my work. My email address is just my last name at gwu.edu, and I'm happy to send people examples of my work if they're interested.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. This has been incredible. I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. I will, of course, remind our viewers that The Fires of Philadelphia is available at Lost City Books. You can stroll right up to our store on 18th Street and grab your copy. We have a few left, and we'll keep ordering them as long as you want them. And you can also hop onto our website and order your copy, and it will be delivered to you. We're so honored to have both of you join us tonight, and thank you again so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Shady. This has been great.
Thank you, Shady.
All right, everyone, and I will play us out with a bit more of the Charles Owen Quartet, a local jazz quartet, DC local jazz quartet.